Hello, I'd like to thank everyone for being here.
Me too.
Thank you, Brian, for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank Major Garrett for being here to join us and talk about his excellent book. As you can see, I've had my fun with it, and I hope that you will as well, and we can have a nice conversation. I think we'll be talking for about 30 minutes. I'll ask some questions, and then we will open it up to the audience, and you can ask your questions, and we can hopefully have a rousing discussion about this book and about Trump's wild ride.
Sure, mine too.
All right. Well, to start us off, I want to ask kind of a big question about the book itself and your thinking in it. You say you give kind of two explanations in the second chapter about why it is that you wrote the book. You write that you undertook the project in order to determine if it was possible, quote, to render a credible, balanced, and nuanced assessment of the first year and a half of the Trump presidency amid its cyclonic spasms. And later, you say that the only goal of this book is to detect or discern the lasting impact of changes brought about by Trump's presidency. And that, quote, it is not the purpose of this book to persuade any reader that these changes were beneficial or harmful, only that they happened and are very likely to last. That's page 42 in your editions. With this in mind, I'd love for you to say a little bit more about why it was important for you to write this book now, for you to write this book sort of 2 years into the Trump presidency, and also what you imagine the ideal audience is for this book. Who do you think needs to read this book? If you're not trying to persuade them that these things are good or bad, what are you trying to persuade them of?
Well, one, that journalism still exists, and it matters, and you can find out what it looks like when you read a book like this. Look, I knew going into this book, and my best friend Steve Albrecht is right there, his father's right there. Steve and I have known each other since we were 8 years old. We grew up here in San Diego. And I was writing the book, I was saying my biggest fear about this book is that it will fall commercially in a very uncomfortable and uncommercial space. That is to say, people who love the Trump presidency will not think the book is praiseworthy enough, and people who despise the Trump presidency will not find it harsh enough. And I always knew that that might be the very uncomfortable and non-profitable commercial space the book might fall in. But I also thought that in an era where there's a conversation about what facts are, do they matter, and can you talk factually and from a neutral, meaning non-judgmental or harshly judgmental point of view about what we're going through in American politics, might that matter? It mattered to me, it mattered to my publisher, and it mattered so far to the people who have reviewed the book who said, you know, this is kind of a breath of fresh air. It helps us remember things we've already forgotten, which I think is another important part of the book and another contribution it makes. And that I knew, because I cover it, because I see the interaction with me on Twitter, I feel it when I go to rallies, there's already a very roiling conversation in the country about what this presidency does or doesn't mean, or what it does or doesn't represent. Putting my thumb on that scale didn't seem to me a productive endeavor at all, and certainly not a journalistic one. One last point about why I wrote the book. For me, it was in its own way my therapy. And what do I mean by that? So my day-to-day life as chief White House correspondent for CBS News, metaphorically and almost literally, my nose is pressed up against the glass of this presidency. And there's all sorts of cyclonic spasms I live through day in and day out. And oftentimes, as my own act of therapy, this book helped me push myself back from that metaphorical glass that my nose is always up against and bring to bear the experience that I've developed over many years of covering American politics. How do things happen? What things are likely to last? And can we make a rendering of that at this stage? And the last point I'd like to make is there's a legitimate question right now. I mean, seriously, do we need another Trump book? I mean, I get that. What point is there possibly of another Trump book? Well, the point is this. This book's about what happened, not what didn't. A friend of mine gave me a very useful metaphor. He said, a lot of the Trump books before yours were like restaurant reviews that only told you how often the chefs argued with each other or how many people slipped on the floor. Your book is actually about what's on the menu, how it's prepared, and whether you might or might not like it. It's actually a restaurant review in that sense, metaphorically. So that's the space it tries to occupy.
That's great. So lifting up that point that you ended with there, I'd love to hear you talk about, you write on page 35 that part of the legacy of Trump's election and presidency is that it divides the national consciousness over simple things, not big ideas like slavery, tariffs, child labor, or civil rights. And I'd love for you to say more about why you think the things dividing the nation during Trump's presidency are simple things, especially since I suspect that locked-in partisans, critics and fans of Trump would say these don't feel at all simple to us. These feel like the big things. So,
well, another part of the book I talk about that we're having this national conversation about the value and centrality and strength of institutions. What are our institutions? How strong are they? How much are they being tested? What's justice? What is the relative power of the executive branch in Congress? What's the relative power of the federal judiciary up against an American president? What do state legislatures do if the president says something on environmental policy is no longer valid? Do they bounce back? Do they respond in kind? We're having this deeply important sort of small r Republican conversation about the construct of our institutions. The free press is also part of that. So in that particular section, I'm saying there are things that we turn on each other about and that Trump, for lots of different reasons, churns with various tweets and things he throws out either as diversionary tactics or simply just to keep the conversation churning and know he's the central force churning it. And those conversations sometimes feel less vital and more trivial than other bigger issues. But I also say in the book that these large structural questions are also being asked and answered, and Trump provokes that conversation as well.
would you say that you think the book offers an argument on the question of whether your readers or observers of the Trump presidency should be concerned about the foundations of the American Republic? You've said that you don't want to talk about what didn't happen. You want to talk about what did happen. But there's definitely a lot of projection about what we imagine may happen.
Right, sure.
And so do you see the book as having a point of view on what some feel is a legitimate fear that our republic is imperiled?
So the book doesn't have a direct voice or point of view to answer that, even ask or answer that question. But it does, I think, lay out a pretty solid case about what happens in a divided country when you have a partisan-aligned Congress with a partisan-aligned president. And the partisan-aligned Congress is willing to use the legislative tools at its disposal to do a few things, such as confirm judges, cut taxes, and go along with that president's particular regulatory agenda. I have a whole chapter devoted to the topic of regulation, not because it's really easy to write or particularly sexy. It's not either. It's very difficult to write and not the least bit sexy. But it's an important part of what's already happened under the Trump administration in terms of taking regulations that had existed and wiping them off the books. I explained in very detailed fashion how that happened, partly with a Republican Congress that was completely compliant and partly by the stroke of the presidential pen. And I described the difference between the last deregulatory president that we had, Ronald Reagan, and why he was far less successful, far less rapidly than Trump was, because he has a completely compliant and utterly ideologically aligned Congress. So one of the themes of the book is when you have this alignment and these procedural processes, these types of things can happen. And I also explain the one instance where it didn't, repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act. Same compliant Congress, same procedures, but a renegade senator named John McCain said no, and that all fell apart. So if there's one theme about the structures we currently have, it's that with this alignment and these procedures, certain things can happen. But I'm also very sharply observant, not critical, but observant that if it required any degree of political cleverness, intuition, hunch, or bipartisanship, with the exception of one issue, two issues actually, opioids and veterans, pre-existing issues where bipartisan compromise was already there and willing to be brought into law, Trump accomplished almost nothing. So to that underlying sort of question about what are our structures, these things happen because of this unique set of circumstances. If they required more than that, they tended not to happen.
On that note, one of the successes that you didn't mention when you were just discussing, but that you write about it at length, is tax reform. And I think one of the interesting things that you lift up, and maybe you can say something about, is the fact that in comparison to the failure to repeal and replace Obamacare, it appears to you, and frankly I found persuasive in your telling, that it seems that despite appearances, Trump seems to have learned something about the legislative process and applied that. Can you say something about that?
And look, it's one of the questions everyone asks about any president. Do they learn on the job? Can you learn on the job? Is it a job that allows you to learn? Well, I think that question has been visited upon Trump with some more regularity because he came in as such an outsider, had no underlying experience as a governor or a senator, anyone in politics. Can he learn? Will he learn? Is he adaptive in any sort of way? And I'm not suggestive he's adaptive in a lot of different ways. I make one particular observation about one particular difference, and it's exhaustively gone into in the book. I'll try to short circuit as best I can for the sake of time. Healthcare, his approach to trying to find votes was to be a pleader and a bargainer, pleading with members of Congress, House and Senate, what do you need, what do you need, and then promising that he would deliver whatever they needed, not understanding that with every promise that got one vote, it was likely to unravel 5 votes someplace else. And that was constantly frustrating the lawmakers on the Republican side who were trying to write the bill. That was one dimension. There were lots of other structural reasons Republicans failed, from their point of view, to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. One of the central reasons is they'd never ever gotten around to actually writing a piece of legislation that was politically saleable to replace it. So that was 6 years of dereliction. Then they win the presidency and have all this power and don't know what to do with it. That's an underlying cause. But just Trump himself goes from pleader and bargainer on health care. On taxes, when he was looking for votes, he would do it much less frequently and only at the direction, specific direction of those who were writing the legislation. And then when he would talk to lawmakers, he would say, what do you need? Okay, I'm writing it down, I hear you. I will hand this information off to the relevant chairman of the relevant committees. Take your argument to them. Meaning, I'm not going to solve this for you. I'm not promising I will solve it for you, and I'm not negotiating for your vote here and now. The other thing he did is he adapted to the realities of the politics on the tax bill. He had said, and you probably remember this, I want a corporate tax rate of 15%. He pounded the table over and over, and he was fixated on this number, 15%. Not for any larger economic reason, he just liked the number, which Trump has a tendency to do. Sometimes it's a strength, sometimes it's a weakness, but he was fixated on 15%. Well, he had to be talked eventually to 21%. I describe how that happened in the tax reform chapter. And those who were around him knew it was a hard lift, but it was liftable, and they did move him. And the bill passed in large measure because he gave this ground. That was also adaptive. So in that one sense, and again, I do not make large pronouncements about this unified theory of Trump's ability to learn on the job. But in these two areas, I thought it was at least worth noting.
So I'm going to switch gears now because I suspect I may be the only person who's really interested in the ins and outs of tax reform here. But I wanted to move on to something that I think might be a little more at the forefront of everyone's mind.
Sure.
I suspect everyone in the audience has heard about the bombs that have been sent to prominent liberals, members of the media in recent days, and according to most recent news accounts, it seems that the accused bomber was something of a fanatical Trump supporter. Without suggesting that the president is somehow personally responsible for the actions of a deranged fanatic, do you find persuasive the argument that it's any way fair to suggest that Trump's rejection of the legitimacy of his opponents, demonization of the media, willingness to encourage or at least shrug off violence at his rallies, contributes meaningfully to an unstable climate of derision, violence, and other forms of chaos?
All right. That's a heavy question, and the most important part of my answer is that my job is to faithfully record what the president says and does about all the things you just raised, okay? And to observe them and to note how different they are from the past that we've experienced in our politics, and stop right there, okay? It's already part of the answer to your question among those who support the president and who have a Republican point of view. They say, well, look, Republicans didn't run around and blame Bernie Sanders when a guy who was a Sanders supporter shot up an entire baseball field of Republicans and tried to kill Steve Scalise. They didn't say it then, and we shouldn't say it now, in the sense of direct, informed causality. Is there something about our particular conversation and approach to politics now that is amplified and has a sense of, if not viciousness, a sense of instant hostility? Yes. Have both political parties at one level or another, and one time or another, describing each other's motives as either corrupt or evil, been at the margins contributing to this atmosphere for the past 20 years or so? Yes, they have. And yet, related to this whole news story, I'll just briefly relate a conversation I had with a colleague of mine in CBS when I was in New York earlier this week. The explosive device story was just breaking. Manhattan was completely knotted up. I had just gotten into the New York bureau. She said, "Major, what do you think about all this? This is so incredible. We've never seen anything like this in our whole country. My 9-year-old is riveted by television. She can't get the phone out of her hands. She's just overwhelmed by all these things. We've never had anything like this." And I said, well, let me just tell you a little bit about what my life was like when I was 6 years old. When I was 6 years old, Martin Luther King was assassinated and Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. The summer before 1968, when I was 5, there were riots in 110 cities in America, and 85 people were killed, and more than 2,000 were injured. In 68, after Martin Luther King's assassination, there were riots in 60 cities, and 45 people died, and more than 4,000 people were injured. And I was kept home from school to watch the funerals of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And that was my experience, watching television and the news when I was slightly younger than your daughter. I'm not saying this is better or worse. I'm just saying we've had some heavy times, some deeply heavy times that made us wonder if this entire structure that we love and believe in was coming apart at the seams. We feel that way now. There are parts of it that do feel, as I write in the book, deeply primal. This feels like a very heavy psychological time in American politics, and disagreement manifests itself so rapidly and takes on such a surprising air of intensity. All of that is true, but we have weathered tough times before. My childhood is just one of those tough times, and I'm always trying to remind, especially my younger colleagues, that at least appreciating, meaning being knowledgeable of these comparative times in history, is at least helpful contextually, if for no other reason.
Another issue that has come up in the news recently is the apparent assassination of the journalist
Jamal Khashoggi,
Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi Arabian embassy in Turkey. And you, as many news outlets have noted, your book is one of the few places where the relationship specifically between Jared Kushner and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS as he's frequently known, is outlined in detail.
Mm-hmm.
So if nothing else, this should move a few more units, I hope. Now, in the chapter that you write about it, you make a big deal about the significance of the Trump administration's attempts at realigning strategic priorities in the Middle East, specifically in the attempt to gain Saudi Arabian cooperation with counterterrorism. You say this quote, may have been the most important foreign policy event of Trump's first year because of its potential to realign the power grid in the Middle East and give the US serious support in suppressing terrorist financing and indoctrination. Yet at the same time, you point out that Trump offered the Saudis, quote, tacit support for whatever moves the kingdom decided would advance that strategic objective. And that he made an implicit promise that, quote, we will not overthrow you and we won't even fret over human rights violations, press freedoms, or labor laws so long as you fight extremism. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, I'd love to hear you reflect on both whether you are concerned that these recent events may imperil the chances for success in this endeavor, and also whether you think it would be fair to say that the Trump administration's posture towards Saudi Arabia may have at least been an enabling factor in this event. So I'd be curious to hear you speak on both points.
So that's everything you just described is the reason I wrote that chapter, in that this was a significant and news-making event that, like many in the first year of the Trump presidency, kind of fell into what I've colloquially come to call the forget-me machine. I mean, something happens and it's a big deal and it seems like the most amazing event of the Trump presidency, and a week later no one can remember it happened because something else has replaced that amazing thing with its own amazingness. I have a chapter in the book called 10 Days in May that starts with the day that James Comey was fired and everything that happened up in the next 10 days. A lot happened. I won't summarize it now. I'll just tell you that White House correspondents who wrote stories, broadcast stories right alongside me, having read my book, came up to me and said, "Major, I forgot half of that stuff." Half of the stuff they themselves wrote or broadcast as professionals, not as a hobby, okay? They're living, and they've already forgotten it. And this question about what was achieved or not achieved in Saudi Arabia, I don't answer. What was set in motion, I do try to describe. And that description has borne out. Trump said in his speech there, and I quote it, "We're not going to question you. We're not going to try to change you. We're not going to bother you with any of your structural intergovernmental actions, as long as you are with us on this overriding, superseding goal of stopping recruitment, rhetorically and otherwise, and choking off financing." And the reason I say the Trump administration is willing to do this and to make this moral choice, which leaves room for all sorts of moral ambiguity over here in pursuit of one larger moral goal here, terrorism, is because many of those who are near the president, and he believes it's like the communism of our time. So you make all sorts of alliances, and you make all sorts of morally dubious choices in pursuit of victory over this one thing, or confronting this one thing. And I describe it that way as I don't believe many others have. And back at this time, the White House was at least nominally open to the idea of cooperating with this book, and so Jared Kushner and I had a long conversation, about 50 minutes, on two topics. Saudi Arabia, because the summit that was organized there, first presidential trip of Donald Trump was to Riyadh, was organized entirely by Jared. And then also the relationship with China. And Jared, in this interview, goes into great detail about how frequently he talked to Mohammed bin Salman and how much he was willing to give him space to pursue all these reforms. And what the president said and how I described it is exactly how this has played out. And the Saudis, for whatever reason, and they're trying to come up with an explanation for what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, but somebody thought it was okay to kill him in a Saudi consulate in another country. Now, I don't know how that got communicated, and I don't know how they figured out that it was okay, and I still don't know how they're trying to figure out that it's not okay and explain the not okay part, but it happened. And it's created all these stressors for the Trump administration. Stressors, but not change. And I don't fundamentally believe, because of the things I describe in the book, that the relationship is going to change. The ironic thing about what's in the aftermath of Jamal Khashoggi to me is it will be direct foreign investment that will slow or crawl and maybe diminish entirely into Saudi Arabia. Meaning, in what I would think is a at least nominal historical irony, multinational corporations will strike a more visible moral pose than the administration of the United States government.
It's a disquieting thought, to be sure.
I'm just saying.
Yeah. So I feel like I would be remiss having you here if I didn't ask you a couple of questions about the media.
Oh, that.
Yes. So I guess I'll start with a slightly fun one that never would have occurred to me had I not read your book. You make what I think is a really intriguing claim early on that I'd love to hear you expand on. You write that whereas, quote, Reagan was a master of the medium of his time, network television, Trump is a master of the medium of his, meaning social media. And yet, on the very next page, page 4, for those of you following along at home, you say, his worldview, Trump's, is not only shaped by TV, his judgment of and reaction to events, true or false, are reinforced almost entirely by TV. You say TV is Trump and Trump is TV, comparing him to Chancellor Gardner from being there. So I guess my question to you is, why do you think it took until the age of social media to give us a president whose worldview is exclusively filtered through television? And is there something about social media that finally delivers to us the kind of dystopian, mediated world that folks like Jerzy Kaczynski and Patty Chayefsky and Niels Postman and David Foster Wallace have been warning us about for decades?
So that's a heavyweight question. They're so much smarter about that stuff than I am. All I will say is the answer to your question, why Trump and why do we wait so long, is I do think there is a component of Trump's own personality, his own ego, to which social media is perfectly adapted. And he perfectly aligns with all of its most visible tendencies, which means constant presence. I think something, I say something. I have a big reach, I can churn, I understand the media culture. I want to constantly be part of the conversation. I feel less comfortable when I'm not constantly part of the conversation. I mean, all the things that certain personalities find very, very addictive about social media, and many personalities, myself, find loathsome about social media, he finds particularly comforting and comfortable. The other aspect of it is, and I think, again, when I use the word appreciate, I just mean acknowledge. I don't mean like or dislike. I just mean in the classical sense, appreciate this. Trump came to politics as a fully formed celebrity. Ronald Reagan was not a fully formed celebrity. Ronald Reagan was a B-movie actor who gave General Electric editorials on the radio and then was governor of California for 2 terms. Trump was the head of a TV show, The Apprentice, for many years that was a very, very popular show. In the top 10 for many years. He was a fully formed celebrity, someone who had lived and breathed and grew to prominence playing in the tabloid culture of New York City, a much tougher media culture than Los Angeles, by far tougher media climate. Pretended to be somebody he wasn't. Would take any amount of ridicule as long as he was still in the story. All of these things fit perfectly in, or at least align themselves comfortably with the matrix of social media. And he's unabashed and unafraid to use it because that reinforces one central pillar of his appeal. I'm not a politician, I'm not scared, I'm not a baby, to use one of his favorite terms, and I will say things that enrage my opponents, delight my supporters, mystify many others, but always keep me in the center of the conversation. And let me give you a quick statistic about this center of conversation notion about Trump and how other people who are trying to adapt to the political world it leaves behind it observe. I have a very experienced and very capable friend of mine in politics who wanted to test out saturation levels of names in American politics right now. So he went to a congressional district in Texas, the 23rd district. It's a competitive House race. Lots is going on in Texas politics right now. So there's a governor's race, there's a Senate race, and there's this House race. So he asked an artificial intelligence company to do a scan of all media in that congressional district for 1 week. Radio, TV, blogs, everything that had any kind of stickiness about political conversation or media. And just count the names, the number of times each of these names are mentioned. So the 2 competing congressional candidates came in at about 250. The governor, Greg Abbott, and his rival came in at about 350. Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke came in at like 550. This is over a week's period of time. Number of times name mentioned in all these sticky places. Trump was 5,000. 5,000. In a rural Texas district in early September 2018. That is a measurement of the pervasiveness of this phenomenon, this conversation, this pulsing, never-ending flow of commentary, awareness, churn. And that's changing not only our emotional reaction to politics, it's changing the methodologies of politics. How do you break through? How do you align yourself? Do you disalign yourself? How do you deal with that? It's just a new reality.
Well, I'd love to follow up on that. I'll ask you one more question about the media, and then I think we'll open it up for questions from the audience. But the question that I have speaks, I think, exactly to that point that you ended with, which is that many observers have suggested that the way that the traditional media lavished attention on Trump, breathlessly covering every tweet, cable networks carrying his rallies live, effectively gave him free advertising and bears significant amount of responsibility for his ascendancy. And in line with this, I'd love to sort of look at the way your book begins, which is in a marvelous prologue where you break down the first words Trump ever spoke to you. But I couldn't help noticing that the first words Trump ever spoke to you were at an event in August 2015 in Birch Run, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And on that first page, you say that you, quote, foolishly thought it was silly rhetoric from a silly reality TV celebrity running a silly campaign for the presidency, which made me wonder, why on earth did CBS send its top White House correspondent to cover something so transparently silly?
Mm-hmm.
What were you doing there in the first place? And indeed, you quote Corey Lewandowski as saying that your presence, quote, meant we were being taken seriously. And all of this made me think about something that your former boss, Les Moonves, famously said, which is that, who would have thought this circus would come to town? It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. The money's rolling in, and this is fun. And so what do you think about the role that decision makers at places like CBS, at mainstream news, in covering Trump so breathlessly played in elevating him to this level where he's getting such outsized attention throughout our politics?
So look, this is the big after-action question that everyone in the media either is or should be asking itself. And I'm not going to be an apologist for these decisions. Why was I there? Because the first Republican debate had happened in Cleveland. That was a show of its own, velocity and weight, and it created tremendous conversation. And we also had a sense that maybe Trump wasn't going away, and maybe this is something we should take a look at. But I did, as I take myself to task, go there, a deeply skeptical frame of mind. Like, what is this? Is this just another marketing campaign? Is this the latest iteration of a way to build a global brand, and that isn't, in the end, as serious as it may, or Trump's early rhetoric suggested it might be? Who knew? I was literally taking myself to task for being someone who didn't say, well, this might be real and maybe you might want to take it more seriously. That's my own way of saying I missed a few things, and if I don't approach my audience saying I missed a few things, I think I come across as something I'm not and something I can't be, which is a know-it-all, because 2016 proved that there isn't really any know-it-allism left, if there ever was in the first place. The deeper question about this coverage of Trump is partly related to something that I think, again, it must be appreciated about when Trump decided to run. Remind yourselves, he flirted with this in 1996 and 2000, didn't run. If he had run in 1996 and 2000, he would have said exactly the same things he said in 2016. Why do I know that? Because he'd been saying them essentially since 1980, with various small variations, but mostly the same thing. And the media atmosphere would have been stronger, more powerful, and more dismissive, and more capable of not falling to the seductive power of clickable stories and instant ratings. Why was it more easy for Trump to exploit that in 2016? Because the business model built around journalism now is much more fragile. It just is, it's just a fact. Network news audiences are smaller, cable news audiences are much more fleeting. Newsrooms and newspapers are shells of their former selves in 1996 and 2000 across the board. Local news stations are smaller in terms of ambition and staffing, more or less. There have been some reversals in the last 2 or 3 years, but the general trajectory has been downward. Market share has been diminishing. And so this idea of structural and institutional commercial weakness up against a formidable pre-existing celebrity who can define the terms of debate, capture eyeballs, capture market share, deliver steady and reliable clicks, become more dependent than they ever have been before. And they become, in its own way, commercially intoxicating. And that's a lamentable but inescapable fact of the 2016 cycle. And anyone in my industry who tells you otherwise is, I guarantee you, kidding themselves and attempting to kid you. And the one thing I will say on behalf of CBS, and it's certainly not on behalf of Les Moonves, because he got into a lot of trouble for saying that and many other things, all justifiable. We granted Trump, I think, over the course of the campaign, 3 phone interviews. Maybe only 2, but no more than 3. That's 3 too many in my opinion, but lots of other networks let him be on the phone all the time. a luxury afforded no presidential candidate under any circumstance in any other previous campaign. Why? Because it's too easy. You just sit on the phone. There's no one of that interaction. Audience can't read you. You can't have any sense of eye contact with the interviewer, or if not eye contact, at least sense of, I can see you, you can see me, you have to sort of prep for this. It's more formal. None of that. You just get on the phone and yak for 25 minutes. Cable networks did that relentlessly. And then the appeal, the curiosity factor of the rallies, again, was so much larger that most of his Republican rivals found no way to compete with that. And the only thing I would say on the other side of appraising that, oh, that's all putting everything in favor of Trump. Look, it's only in favor of Trump long term if what he's selling finds some audience. If it had been 6 straight months of Jeb Bush, I'm not sure that would have helped. Or Marco Rubio, for that matter. There was something about this particular outsider message that for a particular part of a Republican primary voting electorate, a small, by definition, part of the American conversation, but crucial to one question, and one question only, who's going to be the nominee? And as I like to remind audiences all the time, we have a wonderful saying in this country, anyone can grow up to be president of the United States. That's true, so long as you're the nominee of a major party. And what was the central question in that process? Who's going to be the nominee? Well, for that audience, that coverage stuck. And if it wasn't any good or wasn't relevant or didn't mean something to that audience, it wouldn't have. So the media can fairly, and I think should be, faulted for a part of that commercial addiction. But that is not the only explanation. And anyone who tells himself or herself it is the only explanation is missing a crucial part of the story.
Well, I've certainly said more than enough, so I'd love to turn it over to the audience and see if there are folks with questions. If you wouldn't mind, you can stand up, and I will try to repeat your question so that it gets some microphone amplification. Yes, sir.
I was going to ask about polling itself.
Sure.
Because a lot of the polls came out Clinton, I think. Now I don't believe in the polls.
Right, sure.
So how much would you
So
say?
it's a great question about polling. And when you talk to pollsters, what pollsters like to say, and it's true because it's part of the science behind polling is not supposed to be predictive. Polling is about what has happened and what is measurable in the period of time and with the audience from whom it was measured. The problem is, and I fault, again, I'm going to go on a little bit of a confessional binge here, part confessional last answer, part confessional this answer. We don't go into enough detail about what polling is when we talk about it in the media. We talk about it as if it has genuine and lasting predictive value. And pollsters will always say, no, we're not predicting the future. We're telling you what people have told us based on the questions we asked, when we asked them, and of the sample that we asked it of. And that gives you an idea of where a set of questions and responses land, or where candidate preferences at a certain period of time land. In a cumulative sense, if you keep seeing the same, let's say, for example, one candidate is 10 points ahead for 3 straight months. After the last poll, meaning you're now 3 days away from election, and for 3 straight months, one candidate's been ahead by 10 points, you can say with a high degree of mathematical certainty that that 10-point lead is not a mirage and is suddenly going to evaporate. And we've got lots of statistical evidence to support that, okay? So that's the value of polling over a long period of time, and if you see a general sense of trajectory or orientation to either a set of questions or a candidate approval or disapproval. So that's where polling can have some value, okay? But we breathlessly tell you this is what the future is going to be, and this is what you should expect. We ought not to do that. We ought to be much more cautious about that. The second thing about polling is it's become more difficult to do it better and more costly to do it better. Cell phones now are a big part of polling. You also have to have the attention and the willing participation of respondents. People are less willing to do that than they were historically. So getting a large data set costs a lot more money, takes a lot more time, which means there are a lot more bad polls because they're not as the polling entity, the organization, isn't willing to pay the premium to get the better polling. And these bad polls get intermixed with good polls. And as one very experienced pollster told me, the average of, forgive me now, the one PG plus moment of the evening, the average of shit is shit, okay? If you put crappy data in with good data, you're averaging crap. You're not averaging cream, you're averaging crap. And so you get a less instructive set of data when you merge and do, well, the composite of 60 polls is this. Well, when you've added 20 garbage polls to 40 credible polls, you're actually not getting yourself a composite that is as reliable or as indicative of what good polling is. And so we sort of smash all this stuff up. And I feel great sympathy for those in the news-consuming audience who we don't let you in on this at all. And we beat our chest with all this certainty about what's going to happen and its predictive value. And things happen. Variations get into the system, and people make different decisions. People tell pollsters things that aren't true, just like they tell their neighbors and their spouses and their children. They do it to pollsters. That gets into the system. And so I would be so much happier if in our industry we were more circumspect and calmer and transparent about what polls do and do not provide. Because we get addicted to them. Again, that word. Because they're very easy. Oh, the horse race, here's what's going to happen. Isn't this news? Well, sometimes, yes, but oftentimes not as much as we represent.
Another question? Yes, here, right at the front. Hi.
I'm curious what you find most personally disturbing about the Trump administration.
What do I find most personally disturbing about the Trump administration? Well, my core answer to that is I do everything I can to limit my personal reactions to every encounter I have covering politics. My son, Luke, is there. My daughter, Audrey, is there. They're both students here at University of San Diego. When they were younger, and I would come home from work covering a presidential campaign or something else or involved in politics, they would ask me a very logical question. Is that person nice? Do you like them? And I would always disappoint them with my answer. I would say, I don't do like, I don't do nice. I do is. That person is a senator, a president, a congressman, a governor. That person is saying this. That person is running for that. That's what I do. Do I have zero reaction personally to enemy of the people? No, I don't have zero reaction personally to enemy of the people. Do I believe that in the end, whatever becomes of the Trump presidency, 4 years, 8 years, whatever, a legacy item that will never not stick to this president? No, I don't believe that. He will always be there. You can't say that. It's an irretrievable statement. He said it. He owns it. That kind of criticism raises lots of questions about what is or is not a free press, what its value is. I'm perfectly happy to have that conversation. I welcome that conversation. I think it helps intensify the meaning of journalists who do the work they do and the importance that that work plays in a democracy. But that venom does rankle me. But I have to also, as much as it may bother me, tell myself my job is to record it, make sure everyone hears it, allow people to talk about it, and then leave it there. And believe, as I fundamentally do, and this phrase I'm about to utter will sound like it's only about this particular period of time. It's not. I've said it before. I've said it at lots of journalism symposia. It got much less attention back then than it does now. But I said it before Donald Trump was ever a factor in American politics. If I didn't believe what I'm about to say, I wouldn't have been doing the work I've done for 35 years, particularly covering politics, which is this. Credible journalism will always outlast incredible politicians. And I'll leave it at that.
Another question way in the back there.
Would you say that Donald Trump is the first third-party candidate to become president of the United States?
It's a hell of a question. It's interesting. He's not in any sort of true sense a third-party candidate, but it was the closest thing I've seen to a hostile takeover of an existing presidential national party. Now, the one thing I will say, not third party, but he is the second pure branded political figure we've elected to the presidency, pure branded. And what I mean by that, President Obama, Senator Obama, I covered that campaign, 2007 and 2008, was also a brand. He ran as a brand, a vision, an idea, a concept, hope, change, that from its very beginning tried to surmount the noted and visible predilection of the Democratic Party to nominate Hillary Clinton. That's where the Democratic Party was, and superdelegates and the money and the early endorsements across the Democratic Party were tightly aligned and looked to be very, very tightly aligned with Hillary Clinton. Senator Obama ran as a brand and a concept, as a story, as a narrative to challenge that. And it wasn't in every single way a hostile takeover, but it was coming from the outside of the party, earlier than many of the Democratic Party recommended or wanted, and he ascended to the nomination, sort of larger than his party. And the party fell in line. Was instructive for Trump. It's possible, it can happen. You can come from the outside, you can be a thing, you can represent some large-scale notions, you can have things associated with you into which your supporters can pour all sorts of their own specifics. I talked to countless Obama supporters. For them, hope and change meant literally dozens of different things. It was a very wide vessel you could pour your hopes and dreams and aspirations or political policies into. Same thing with Make America Great Again. What does that mean? It can mean a lot of things. That creation of a brand, an identity, a concept, not so much I'm Republican or I'm Democrat, but I'm a concept. And then I'm a brand that goes along with it, and I've got slogans and posters and imagery that is instantly recognizable, becomes larger than the party construct itself. Now, my distinguished moderator here, because he's got a PhD in political science, I believe, right? Knows what I'm about to say, that in the canon of political science, for quite some time, has been this theory that the party decides. It's one of the great texts in American political science, the party decides. I'm here to tell you, Senator Obama and Donald Trump have completely toppled that entire orientation to the party decides. No, they've proven that the brand can surmount party, the brand can take over the party, and the brand in its dimensions and how it expresses itself can be more potent than the party. So I wouldn't say a third party president, but I would say the second distinctly branded, commercially or intellectually or conceptually branded president we've had. It's a great question, though.
Back there, yes.
So, from the beginning, since when Trump was first elected president and his coverage has been going on increasingly in news sources, mostly on cable news, to kind of like bring in more of his viewers, there's been increasing sentiment, even amongst young people in universities such as here, that if they want to go and get the news, they need to go to other lesser known news sources and not just go on larger cable news.
Sure.
Do you think that that's a damaging effect that's going to last beyond Trump's presidency? And how do you think that's going to kind of shape how young people and how readers digest the news afterwards?
It's a great point. It's a great question rooted in actual experience. And I do sense, not just among viewers, consumer of news, your age and of like age, a sense of exhaustion or fatigue about this, either fascination or saturation, depending on the hour of the day and depending on your tolerance level, with the Trump story. And one of the reasons this book exists is to take that kind of fire hose coverage and turn the spigot down a little bit and slow it to a digestible, drinkable pace, if you will, to completely outrageously extend the metaphor. And allow people time and space to have some common facts and some shared observations about what's happened and what the powers of the presidency are and how they've manifest themselves. And it's also, back to the confessional, you know, I shouldn't have to do that. I'm a network news correspondent with a big network and a big brand and a name. Has that already been done? No, we haven't done that. Because there's so much fascination on all these other things, many, many things that are about the Trump experience. I say in the book, one of the hardest things about, this was true during the campaign, it's true during the presidency, one of the hardest challenges is separating the interesting over here and elevating the important. Because there's lots that's interesting that drives cable coverage for hours a day. That's interesting, flashy, debatable, conversational, but is it really important? That's a big challenge. One of the reasons I wrote the chapter on deregulation is I'm convinced at some point in the future, something's going to happen. And someone's going to say, as a part of the reaction to whatever it is that happened, didn't we have something to deal with that? Wasn't there a regulation or some component of federal supervision? Well, we did. Well, we got rid of it. When? Well, back then. Well, what were we covering? What were we talking about? Well, it wasn't that. You know, and that's why I went out of my way to sort of plow that sometimes dense and not the most fascinating reading ground, but just document it and say these things have happened and they're continuing to happen, and this is part of an ongoing part of the story. To consumer habits, trust me, students of your age, your vintage, are not the only ones stressing out or opting out and finding other places to get their news. One of the truisms of the last 20 years in journalism is it is much less hierarchical, much less sort of unidimensional, lots of choices across lots of different platforms, ideological points of views, thoroughness of dissemination and gathering of facts, lots of choices. You didn't ask for a general theory of news consumption, but since I have the opportunity, I'll provide it to you, which is this. It's very simple. And I say this to lots of audiences. And I certainly have to professionally practice it, but I think it's helpful in a general sense. If from the time you wake up in the morning to the time you go to sleep at night, whatever news you've consumed that day has, in every way, left you feeling satisfied, happy, and reaffirmed, you're doing it wrong.
I just want to speak up in defense of the deregulation chapter. I thought it was good. I
Good,
enjoyed
good.
it. You keep saying mean things about it, but I really enjoyed it. We have a question over here.
So it seems to me one of the scariest phrases is fake news, because it allows you to hide behind or do whatever you want to do. So how does the media deal with that now? I mean, it seems scary because it's really hard to figure out what is
Sure.
true and what's not.
Sure. So it speaks to this underlying question. Well, is it true? Trust me, people were asking that before Donald Trump said fake news. You know, what's news? What's verifiable? What's credible? Look, I've been in this industry since 1984. When I worked in Amarillo, Texas, okay, and I was a cop reporter, residents there who were unhappy with my questions about what happened on a police story, either because they were a victim or they knew somebody who was a perpetrator, would say to me with venom in their expression, all you're here for is to sell more papers. You don't care what the truth is. All you want to do is sell papers and get into people's business. That is literally a direct quote that I heard numerous times. So this idea of what my motives were and what was truth or not truth is not new, conceptually. Has it been weaponized with this fake news thing? Of course it has been. That's obvious. You don't need me to tell you that. What do we do about it? Here's what I do about it. Let it ride. Like every political slogan, it'll die out. It'll die out. Everyone will use it for a while, and then it'll die out because it will lose its utility. Why? Because if you keep saying it especially if you say, well, that's fake, and it turns out to be true, provably true, demonstrably true, guess what? It isn't fake, and you're the fake. And if you just use it willy-nilly, it becomes what? White noise after a while. Every political slogan has some saliency for some period of time, or it wouldn't become a political slogan. But over time, they all evaporate. They all fade away. And on this one, this from me and from my perspective, I don't fret about this. It will be used. It will be used routinely. And people will get to compare and contrast and call the question and ask and find out what's fake and what's not. And when all that dust settles, facts will still be there and slogans will disappear. So I'm okay with that.
So we've got a question back there in the back.
In the past 35 years you have been writing, how would you say is most effective in maintaining your neutrality and leaving out personal opinion and emotion? And what do you feel is the most important part of neutrality?
Most important part, what?
Neutrality.
Oh, what's the most important part of it, of neutrality? So that it exists. I mean, it's an existential question, so the best answer to any existential question is to exist, is that it be. And I went to school at the University of Missouri. It's the first school of journalism in the world. It's regarded by many, myself included, as the best school of journalism in the country. And it teaches a deep rigorousness about this very question, about what you do and how you approach a topic of journalism. And I had a conversation with some students here on campus earlier today, and there was one of them pulled me aside afterwards and asked me some questions that are related to an ethics question and paper he needs to write for one of his communications courses. And it had a couple of case studies in there. And in the process of discussing these ethical questions in this case study for this paper, I said, well, you know, as a reporter, you can't go to a protest unless you're covering it. He said, what? I said, that's right. He said, what do you mean, I can't go to a protest? Even if I'm not covering it? I mean, to protest, to display my political point of view? I said, no, you can't. He goes, why? I said, because that makes you an actor in a political conversation. And if your career comes anywhere close to that, journalistically, you're now compromised. Maybe not intellectually, maybe not professionally, but visually and by reputation you are. You raise a question about your neutrality. Now, look, there are plenty of people who are much smarter than I am who would say, Major, you can't stare anyone in the face and credibly tell them you're neutral. You're not a robot. You have emotions, you have feelings, you have points of view. Don't sit here and try to tell me you don't have any reaction, which I don't. I don't tell you that. What I do tell you is I've lived an entire career in full public view where after prizing that career, people come up to me with some regularity and say, I have no idea where you're coming from. And I say, that's the point. You're not supposed to know where I'm coming from. And unhappily, in my industry, that makes me somewhat distinguished now. My age also does that. Age always distinguishes you for some strange reason. I don't know why. But people say, I like you because I don't know where you're coming from. That used to be all journalists, okay? That used to be almost everyone who did what I do. Now we have a lot more commentators and a lot more people, I call them spout animals, who just show up on television sets and just spout for 5 or 10 minutes. And then they go back in their cage, and then they're fed, and they come out and spout some more. And I'm really, this is not confessional, this is just sort of a mini diatribe of mine. I've had enough of spout animals. Because what spout animals do is they bench actual journalists. I started in television at CNN in 2000, 24-hour news. I was so excited. Wait, 24 hours for news? Not actually. You got about 6 hours for news. About 18 hours for commentary. You know, and that was the ratio then. It's probably like 2 hours of news now and 22 hours of commentary. On most other networks, you see it every hour. The reporters show up for like the first 4 minutes, and the rest of the hour, there's no reporters at all. I'm all for reporters. I'm all for neutral observers who tell you the facts and get out of the way and let you figure it out. That's been my whole approach to my whole life in journalism. The first 2 books I wrote with a Democratic member of Congress. The third book I wrote about was the whole Gingrich Revolution. I'm probably the only person you'll ever meet who, as was mentioned earlier before, got paid to write a cover story by Mother Jones and the Weekly Standard. That's pretty wide, folks. What's the common denominator there, I ask you? I'll tell you, short answer, kind of a joke. The check's cleared, okay? Not insignificant when you're a young aspiring journalist and you need to make money on the side. So I can live in all those worlds and am happy to do it in pursuit of the most verifiable rendering of the set of truths I've been asked to capture, collect, synthesize, and explain.
Yes, sir, right in the front here.
I know this young man right here.
Oh, all right.
Hello, Tim Katzman.
Hello, Major. How are you? Welcome. Could you hearken back to election night in 2016 and perhaps share with us what sort of range of emotions you went through without divulging where you were standing that evening about what was happening, what was taking place? It seemed almost unpredictable to many.
To many, it seemed unpredictable. It didn't seem impossible or unpredictable to me. So I was on camera. I was in the Hilton Midtown Manhattan, the headquarters. My most dominant emotion was exhaustion. I was completely worn out. I'd been on the road for 16 months. And all of us covering the final week of the Trump campaign were doing 2 or 3 rallies a day, constantly flying, starting at 6 a.m. and ending at 2 in the morning, and waking up with 3 or 4 hours of sleep and moving along down the road. That's just the reality of the end of the campaign. And I told my network a week before, I talk about it in the book, don't be surprised if Trump wins. I'm not predicting it, but don't be surprised. It could happen. And I communicated that. I mentioned the conversation to our political director, Anthony Salvanto. He generally agreed. So on election night, it started off in one space. And I talk about this in some detail in the book. All the happy appraisals from those who were with the Clinton campaign talking about the emerging Clinton coalition and all this sort of stuff looked plausible. The exit polling data was very bad for Trump. The people I knew who were close to Trump did not read it any other way. They didn't say, well, there's some missing magic in that data. It's all going to work out well. They're like, no, that looks really garbage. That looks terrible. We might be done by 10. One of them told me. Okay. I put that in my brain space and said, came on at 7 o'clock for our election coverage. They're troubled. They're not encouraged by what they see in Florida. They're nervous. That's where we were. And as things changed, and I talked to people, and suddenly they threw into a lot of resources, getting people on the phone for the panhandle of Florida, because that's in the central time zone. There's 10 counties there, very important. They started throwing resources in there. I started talking to people in Florida, saying it's not lost. It may watch closely. Things may jump back. Same thing I was picking up in North Carolina. When those states got closer, and I thought, there's some trend lines here, I shifted my attention to sources I had in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Was picking up also things there. I talk about this in the book. I think I was one of the first, if not the first network correspondent, about 10 minutes before 11, might have even been earlier, it might have been 10 before 10, to say, in Trump Tower, they see pathways to victory. And my anchor people are like, what? I'm like, they do, and here's how. And I go into some detail in the book about people I talked to in Pennsylvania, former governors and otherwise, who knew what was going on the ground and could see things moving in a certain direction. And that just played itself out all night long. And I didn't have any reaction to it one way or the other. I was just trying to get ahead of the story and explain it as best I could. And I'll put my reporting that election night up against anybody's, on television for sure. And that's the whole ball game. Know where the sources are, know where the story's going, and get there first, if you can. And try to contextualize it and explain it. And I literally walked out of the Trump Tower, or not Trump Tower, but the Midtown Hilton at 4 a.m., walked 3 blocks down the street, got a cheeseburger, went back to my hotel, took a shower, went back to work. And that's the way it was. To quote somebody else who used to work at CBS a long time ago.
All right, well, I think that's about the time that we have. We can continue this conversation out in the sala, where we're going to be having a reception, and there will be books for purchase.
Yes, that's the big thing. Books for purchase.
I heard something about the importance of checks clearing.
Anyway, before we go, just thank you for all being here. I really appreciate it. And before we go, my brother right here, Major Garrett, is right here. So please a round of applause for my beloved brother. I mentioned Tim Katzman, my friend Steve, his father, Carl Albrecht, is here. Jimmy Van Norman, all friends of the family, my son, my daughter. Thanks, you all, for being here. It's been great.
Thank you.